I was asked to give testimony about how God called me into mission. And it's not quite 60 years ago, believe it or not, that I went to my very first WEC youth camp. And it was in Camas Bay in Anglesey. I can remember it really well because that was where the Lord confirmed to me that he wanted me to serve him on the mission field. As a child, I feel when I think back, I was quite privileged because I was brought up in church. I was just a few days old when I first went to church, and I was always there on a Sunday 3 times, and in the week, right from being very small, I was in church. I was in my teenage years, early teenage years, really, when I gave my life to Christ, and then that's when I really wanted to serve the Lord and to know him in my life. But even though I didn't really hadn't asked Jesus to be my Lord and Savior at that point, but as a child, a small child, I was always interested in missions. I was always interested if the missionaries came to the church, because they always came for dinner, and I loved that. I remember also when I was quite young, I probably was about 10, that my mum took me to hear somebody named Gladys Aylward. I don't know how many of you older ones might know who Gladys Aylward was. She was known as the Little Woman. She served in China. There was a film made about her called The Inn of the Six Happiness. And I'll just remember it was so amazing. She came and she spoke at Montfort Hall, of all places. And my mum took me to hear her. So back to the WEC camp that I went to for my very, very first time at camp. And my village leader was Dr. Helen Roseveare. We were in groups of 10. I'd never camped before either. And there was like 3 tents, and that was called a village. And my village leader was Dr. Helen Roseveare. And she had just arrived back from the Congo, where she'd been caught up in this horrendous Congo uprising. She'd seen many of her colleagues, missionaries, murdered. She herself had suffered tremendously at the hands of the Congo rebels. And yet she was just an amazing woman. And I just remember so powerfully her testimony of how God had taken care of her. Then the Bible talks at that camp. I can even remember that. And this is 60 years ago, whereby a person called Len Moles, he was the leader of WEC at the time, but he had spent a lot of his time, missionary time, in Nepal. And his talks were about the ascent of the inner Everest. He had climbed Everest, and he talked about how we went on in our Christian life by talking about the ascent of the inner Everest inside us. But the one thing that did impress me, and this is where the Lord called me and said to me, he wanted me on the mission field. There was a missionary there, a candidate. She hadn't gone yet to the mission field. She was about ready to go, and she gave her testimony. And in her testimony, I heard God challenge me, because part of her testimony, she read Numbers 32, verse 6. And this is what it says in Numbers verse 32 and verse 6. It says, "Shall your brothers go to war, and shall you sit here?" So it was the King James version, because in those days that's what we had. And it says, "Shall your brethren go to war, and shall you sit here?" And I knew that God was talking to me and saying to me, "Is Joe going? Did Dr. Helen Roseveare go? Are all these other people going to the mission field? And are you going to stay in England?" And I said, "No, Lord, I'm just going to follow you wherever you want me to go." Now, of course, I was still in school when God called me and lit that fire of missions into my heart. And, you know, it would be so easy to put the fire out, wouldn't it, when you're just young? But through reading my Bible and going to camp year after year after year, and then being part of leadership at the camp for a lot of times, eventually went to Bible college and went on then to serve the Lord in Vietnam and in Indonesia. And even in my later years now, I'm serving God with Mission Aviation Fellowship. And what a blessing it's been. There's been hardships, but there's hardship in every life, isn't there? But it's, you know, to follow God in our lives is so important. So the important thing here is to remember that you're never, ever too young to be called by God, to hear God's call on your life. You're never too young. And that always stirs my heart. But you know, when we've heard God call us as a young person, we need to continue to be encouraged and to allow that call to grow in our lives. And that's what's so important. You know, we can hear God talk to us, but we need to allow that to grow and grow until God brings it to fruition, until God brings it to completeness in our lives. And who knows where the Lord might take you? You never know. It's an exciting journey sometimes. But you know, there are some 2 Bible verses that have always comforted me and always been a blessing. And one is from Deuteronomy chapter 31 verse 6, which says, he will never leave you or forsake you. So I know that the Lord has never left me or forsaken me. And the other one is from Matthew 28, and the very last bit that Jesus says, and he says, I am with you always, even to the end of the world. So we need to remember that, because the world's a mighty big place. Who knows where God is going to send you and ask you to go and tell people about Jesus. Thank you.